Okay. All right, so we should be recording now. Let me hit a little, there we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to our computer banquet. I am Erin Rico. I'm the president of Society. And our special guest speaker tonight is Dr. Madeline Mackey, who will be discussing Yes.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well when you turn away.
Oh, is it pronounced Lepro?
Yeah.
Okay. Virtually, please keep in mind that will be recorded. Also, please turn off your microphone to minimize interference. And with that, I will give the floor to you.
All right, thank you all for having me. As was mentioned tonight, one of the things that I'll be talking about is a long-term project myself and my colleagues have been on, which is the Leprel Mammoth Site. And I'll be talking a little bit to start about kind of the importance or why we care about mammoth sites when we talk about Pleistocene occupations in North America. And then I'll talk a little bit about the site itself and what we're finding there and how it's really interesting and could tell us a lot more information about the fluted point period across North America, because we have identified not only potentially some mammoth butchery, but also a camp that was occupied by the people who called this place home a little under 13,000 years ago. Now, to start, one of the classic images of the Paleo or the Pleistocene or Ice Age time periods in North American archaeology is a small band of hunters stalking or taking down a multi-ton animal, often a mammoth. Now, when we talk about Ice Age archaeology in North America, we're talking about some of the earliest communities that lived across this continent. And they encountered a number of animal species that are no longer extant across North America today. And this did include a number of elephant-like species, mammoths, mastodons, etc., and also some other fauna which has since gone extinct. Now, for a long time, this image of a small group of hunters stalking a multi-ton animal has really typified the Clovis time period. So when we talk about Clovis in North America, we're talking about sites that date between about 12,800 years ago to just over 13,000 years ago. And they're really typified by those classic Clovis points, which are lancelet and have a big flute taken out of the center of them. And I'll show you an example of a few of those in a moment. Now, sites of this age are relatively uncommon when we compare them to other sites across North America, partially because of their age, and also probably because we're talking about a lot less people living across the continent compared to subsequent time periods. Now, lots of times when we talk about the Clovis time periods, there's really a relatively small number of sites that really form our understanding of this time period. We can talk about 40 major sites that are discussed a lot in the literature. Now, there are many more sites than this that date to the Clovis time period or have Clovis artifacts on them, but they may not have a very large assemblage. They may just be from surface materials, which makes it a little more difficult to do some archaeological investigations on them, or they may have been excavated and kind of underreported since their excavation. So there's really 40 sites across 40-ish sites across North America that really define how we talk about the Clovis time period. Now, a significant or notable portion of these sites are associated with Proboscidean remains. Now, when I say Proboscidean remains, I'm basically referring to mammoth, mastodons, and their kin, gomphotheres. So these are 3 Proboscidean elephant species that we have living in the late Pleistocene, very end of the Ice Age across North America. And these different species, mammoths and mastodons, are found across the continent. Gomphotheres are basically their tropical, slightly smaller cousins. And we see these in more southern reaches of the continent. And all three of these species have been found in contexts associated with stone tools and other materials that makes us think they were butchered and certainly probably hunted, at least occasionally, by the people that we now call the Clovis culture. Now, up here you can see these 40 sites that are commonly discussed in the Clovis literature, and those that are or have remains of proboscideans at them. Mammoths, mastodons, or gomphotheres are indicated in red, and the site I'll be talking about today, Leprelle, is indicated in green. So you can see that this makes up a pretty noticeable portion of these Clovis sites, particularly when we talk about the stretches of the plains, particularly the west side of the plains where we come up against kind of the Rocky Mountains. There's a number of particularly mammoth kill sites in this region that have really helped define Clovis. Now, part of the reason why Clovis and mammoths have been so closely associated or commonly talked about is, one, it's really cool, right? Like this idea of hunting a very large animal with tipped spears is a very interesting thing to talk about. And it also was one of the first things that we discovered when we defined the type of Clovis itself. So the first published discovery of Clovis materials in association with Ice Age fauna was the Blackwater Draw site located in New Mexico. This was actually around basically the same time, actually slightly earlier, but it wasn't reported until after. We see another discovery of a Clovis point, pictured right here, in association with mammoth remains at the Dent site, which is located in northern Colorado. And very shortly after this, we had a number of discoveries there's about 15 widely accepted sites today where we see materials that we often associate with Clovis and mammoth remains spatially associated, suggesting that these animals were hunted. Now, beyond just this being kind of an interesting thing, because we don't have mammoths anymore in our world anywhere today, understanding how Clovis people or other Pleistocene communities interacted with mammoths is really important for understanding how they lived their lives. And this is because if you are hunting proboscideans, especially if you're hunting them consistently, this is going to have some big impacts on how you live your life. So one of them, or one common debate or discussion that we'll hear among Pleistocene archaeologists talking about Clovis people is how often did they hunt these large game animals? Were they what we call specialists, where they're pursuing, or lots of their lifeways are dependent on hunting big animals like mammoths and mastodons, or do they have a much broader diet breadth that includes a lot of resources and only take those game animals really occasionally? This also has really big implications for what we call their residential mobility. So basically, how often are they moving their homes? If you are spending lots of time pursuing really large game, you're going to be moving your house a lot to be able to follow those resources. Now, we've known based off studies of stone tool raw materials and other kind of aspects of Clovis life that they were relatively highly residentially mobile. These were communities that were moving long stretches across the landscape and quite consistently. This is also going to have big impacts on who does what in the community, or what we call division of labor. You can really see this typified by some research that was completed by Nicole Waguespack in the early 2000s. Which I show in this chart here. So basically, this is a study of current and recent foraging communities, which compares the percentage of meat that they are consuming in their diet versus the percentage of tasks that are predominantly performed by women. And what you see is that as there is more meat in the diet, women tend to complete a higher percentage of tasks in the communities. This includes things like we often see women doing hide processing in almost lots of forager communities, regardless of the percentage of meat. But there's also things like fire management, firewood collection, building of homes, maintenance of different tools and other raw materials. And we see that as more time is spent, or more of the diet, more time is spent hunting, or more of the diet is part of meat, we see women doing more and more tasks and a greater diversity of tasks in these communities. So basically, we do see that Clovis hunters are consistently hunting proboscideans. We're going to expect big differences in how they're structuring who does what within the communities themselves. Obviously, there's also big interest in proboscidean hunting in regards to technology. So how are people taking down these animals? What do the technologies look like that are in a classic Clovis toolkit? And then there are always, or for a long time, there has been debates about what caused the end of these species. Was it climate? So coming out of the Ice Age itself, was this aided by human hunters consistently hunting them? Or was it some combination of both of them? So there's always been this big focus in Clovis archaeology on understanding the contributions or the frequency of mammoths in the Clovis diet. Now, this brings us to some of our interest in the Laprelle Mammoth Site and basically how this story starts. So in 1986, two locals to Douglas, Wyoming, the town that is found closest to the Laprelle site, found a series of large bones protruding from a bank of the Laprelle Creek. Laprelle Creek is obviously where the site gets its name. Now, the locals immediately knew that they had something potentially of interest, and eventually George Frizen, Dr. George Frizen, a well-known Pleistocene archaeologist at the University of Wyoming, was notified. And in the spring of 1987, he brought a small crew out to the site to test around these mammoth remains and see if there were any archaeological materials. Now, as far as where we are talking about, the Laprelle site is located in the eastern central portion of Wyoming, outside the town of Douglas, Wyoming. You can see the site itself sits in this terrace next to Laprelle Creek, where it has been actively eroding out since before its discovery in 1986. Now, we should note this is about a mile from the confluence of Laprelle Creek with the North Platte River. So there's some big waterways around here. And this is certainly a very clear kind of passage through the state itself. Now, in the spring of 1987, Dr. Frizen and his crew excavated about a 3 by 4 meter excavation area and recovered the partial remains of a Columbian mammoth, along with a handful of artifacts. Now, one thing to note, on here it says a young Columbian mammoth. This mammoth was not fully grown. We still see some disconnected growth plates, but it was nearly fully grown. This is not like a little tiny mammoth. This is a nearly full-grown animal. It would have been larger than any living elephant species today when it passed away. Now, here you can see some of the mammoth remains. They were partial. It is mostly the body or the kind of the torso of a mammoth that was found. We do not have any of the limb bones. And that may be because they actually washed down the creek. So this is actually the edge of the terrace, and we have certainly lost some archaeological material to natural erosion from Laprelle Creek. Now, within this 3 by 4 meter excavation block, they recovered 9 flakes, so materials taken off for, say, resharpening a stone tool. They also recovered 1 possible hammerstone, and then 1 stone tool, which you can see pictured up here. And that is how the site sat until we returned in 2014. Now, I should say this is not just me on this project. This is a very strong collaborative effort. My colleagues include Drs. Todd Surville and Robert Kelly, who are both at the University of Wyoming. Also includes Dr. Spencer Pelton, who is currently the Wyoming State archaeologist, and Dr. Matthew O'Brien, who is a professor at California State Chico. Dr. Pelton and I both started on the project as graduate assistants, but have stuck around for the last 8 years, continuing to work on this project. Now, we first returned to this site in 2014 with basically the goal of trying to figure out if those artifacts were actually associated with the mammoth remains and to see what we could say about the butchery of a mammoth at the site. Now, we started by reopening the original excavation block on site, which you can see pictured here in gray. When all of us first returned to site in 2014, I think we had these dreams of like, pulling out some like giant mammoth crania and tusks and like casting things and all of these large materials. And really, we have not found that many more mammoth remains. It looks like the 1987 excavations happened to hit the densest portion of this bone bed. Although we have found a few other fragments, identifiable fragments of mammoth remains, like this is probably a mammoth navicular, which is a foot bone that we see, along with some other small bone fragments. Now, we also, I think we're imagining finding some amazing Clovis points and Clovis artifacts. And we certainly did find some stone tool material on the site, but certainly most of it was pretty small. So in total, in all this area we excavated right around the mammoth remains, we found about an additional 60 flakes, most of which are about this size. So this is 1 centimeter right here. You can fit all of these on like the surface of a dime. And we found these are pretty typical of what we found right around the mammoth remains. We were also able to take a look at some of the previous collections for this site. Including the flake tool that was found in 1987. We actually ran that for blood residue analysis that looks for, or that can theoretically identify different blood types that tool has been in contact with. And it did test positive for elephant protein residue, suggesting that at some point in the past, that tool had been associated with mammoth remains. Now, certainly all of this comes together to tell us a little bit of a story that kind of confirms this image in some ways, right? Well, we certainly didn't find, like, say, a large number of projectile points. We did find lithic artifacts in direct association with a set of mammoth remains, with indications that these were deposited at the same time and contemporaneous, suggesting that people had participated in potentially killing this animal or at least butchering it after scavenging it, potentially after it had passed away. Now, really, if you think about how much work goes into an excavation, that may have been kind of the end of the story if it wasn't for a stroke of luck. Now, one thing I mentioned is that a lot of the artifacts that are on this site are very small in size. And the way that we're recovering those is we are actually water screening. So we use mesh that's 16th inch, so about the size of your window screen, and we use that to sift through and look for artifacts. Now, this includes walking buckets of dirt down to our screen setup, and this is our original excavation block, and this is where our screen setup is. So students were having to kind of walk across this precarious eroding slope. So we had a crew member on site, Dr. Rich Adams, who's a longtime Wyoming archaeologist, and he was helped clearing a path for us. And right about here hit an artifact that was really unexpected. That is this. Now, this is certainly not the most beautiful artifact you may have seen or what you immediately think of when you think of Ice Age archaeology, but in fact is a very important artifact in the story of this site. This is a chopping tool. This is a river cobble, and you can see that it's had a few flakes taken off of it to make a sharp edge. And if it was flipped over, you would see a couple flakes taken off the backside as well. This tool is probably from right on site. It's probably made very quickly and easily by the communities that were at the site at the time. Now, what makes it really remarkable is how far away it was found from the mammoth remains. This was found on our first 10 days on site, where we had been working in some of this area up here. And this chopper was found about 12 meters away, kind of eroding out of this bank. We did find it in place, so we do know that it came out of the same stratigraphic position, kind of elevation, as the mammoth remains we were finding further up. And so it started this question for us of, maybe there's more to this site than we're thinking. So when we started to return to site, we started expanding our excavations in aerial extent. And we have really excavated a pretty large portion of this terrace in the ensuing 8 years. So this is our excavations as it stands as of August 2022. We're still actively working on this site. We've excavated just over 180 square meters in total. Now, one thing that's a little challenging about excavating at this site is that all of the archaeological materials are buried about 3 meters, so 9 to 10-ish feet beneath modern ground surface. And as far as we can tell, or as far as we've seen and we've checked, there's no archaeology in the terrace above this Pleistocene Ice Age level. Now, what this means is that it's not as simple as just saying, let's stick in a unit over here. We need to open up different areas with a backhoe to be able to effectively test. So over the years, what we've been doing on this site is basically testing as best we can and opening up different stretches of the site with backhoes and then carefully excavating through the archaeological materials. And throughout this process, what we've really been doing is we've been chasing the densest concentrations of artifacts to try to get an understanding of what the site looks like itself. Now, for a glimpse of some of the things that we're finding and what they mean, we can turn to the first area that we excavated, which is right down here. And we now call block B as its official names. It's kind of for fun name is the chopper block, because this is right around where that chopping tool was found in 2014. Now, this is the excavations right around that chopper block area in 2016. When we came to site in 2015, we did a little testing in this area, thought that there might be some more artifacts, and really opened up a pretty good expanse in this area in 2016. You can see some of our graduate student workers and field school workers from 2016 here on site, and the very strong game of archaeology yoga that we commonly play at the LaPrelle site, since we do stick we dig pretty continuous blocks of archaeology. Now, the first indication that this was a pretty exceptional or that something different was going on here was that we have a very large amount of ochre on this site. So ochre, hematite, is a natural red pigment that seems to have been transported onto this site in really large quantities. Now, here is a photo of block B at kind of the height of the ochre layer, and you can see that there are some dark patches of kind of pink dirt throughout this. And it really stands out if we color enhance this photo with a program called D-Stretch. So you can really see these high concentrations of ochre throughout this region. It really concentrates into a stain that is right here that is about 2.5 meters by 1.5 meters this way. And the ochre was dense enough in this region that it actually stained the sediment, the dirt pink for a couple of levels. We also shot in about Sorry, I'm having mouse issues today, apparently. We shot in a couple, about 1,200 little ochre nodules throughout this region as well. Now, there is a little bit of natural ochre that comes out of the LaPrelle Creek, but it is nowhere near this quantity of ochre. We've also done some preliminary chemical analysis on this ochre, and we think it's coming out of the Hartville Uplift area. And in fact, the comparator that we used was from the Powers 2 site, which is a known Paleo-Indian ochre mine in that region. Now, in addition to ochre, we also found some additional stone tools. So here is our chopping tool that tipped us off to this area. And here are a bunch of other stone tools that we see. Lots of flake tools, so general use tools for butchery, etc. We also see this end scraper, which has been fractured through burning in this region. And most of these are probably also from the Hartville Uplift. There's some pretty classic indications of chert from the Hartville Uplift, like this butterscotch with dendrites in it, is very characteristic of this region. Now, we also found some other unusual artifacts, and this included some bone artifacts. So up here, you can see a series of bone needle fragments that we found around the ochre stain. This one here, you can see preserves a portion of its eye. So this is definitely a bone needle. We also found this object, which we think might be a bead. You can see there are some cut marks on it. It also still has a little bit of ochre stained sediment stuck to it in this photo, really telling you right where it came out of. Now, the stories from this area kept being told as we also took the materials back to the lab. So one thing that we noticed as we were doing laboratory analysis, things like counting artifacts from the screen, et cetera, was that there seemed to be some spatial patterning in this portion of the site. So one of the first things that we noticed was that there was some calcined bone in this portion of the site. And calcined bone is basically bone that has been heated super, super hot, and it turns white and really friable. And we noticed that the calcined bone that we were seeing in this portion of the site was concentrated all in kind of one area. We also started doing lithic analysis on mostly the flakes that we found in this portion of the site. And we noticed that some of them had indications of burning in the form of crazing or pot lids, and that those burn flakes were also concentrating in basically the same area as we see this calcined bone. And we started suspecting that this was probably what we could call a hearth-centered area. So there probably used to be a hearth or a fireplace or fire at the center of this location. And that is based off kind of these independent measures of calcined bones and also burned artifact frequency. We also implemented another method that had been conceived of by one of my colleagues, Todd Surivel, and his colleague, Nicole Wagesbeck, which basically looks at how many artifacts you have per square meter versus what percentage of them are burned. And they've discovered that when you have a lot of artifacts in one location that are also burned, that's a pretty good indicator that there is a hearth present there. And that is, in fact, what we see going on in this portion of the site as well. So this is probably telling us that somewhere right in this region where you see our reconstructed hearth, we probably used to have a fire in the past. Now, being able to identify a hearth-centered activity area is really, really important if we're talking about hunter-gatherer archaeology and reconstructing life in the past. And this is for a variety of reasons. When we talk about hunter-gatherers, oftentimes hearths are really the centerpiece of their lifeways and also their homes, in the sense that oftentimes, particularly, really if you're living in many different climates, but especially if we're going to talk about a cold climate like Ice Age Wyoming, a hearth is going to be a place of heat. It's also going to be a source of light and is something that we see often being constructed both in interior and exterior places. And these are really the centerpiece of hunter-gatherer households. And we see this throughout the ethnographic record when we talk about mobile households as well. So we see the importance of hearths in maps that have been produced for communities that live a hunter-gatherer or a mobile pastoral lifestyle, in the sense that there are often hearths that are centers of activities either within homes or outside them. Now, hearths are also really important because we can use them to kind of see the architecture of different spaces and see if people are living in interior or exterior spaces and what types of activities they may be doing around that hearth. And I'll show you how we do that in a moment. Now, another thing that's really important about hearths is they allow us to start kind of seeing sites beyond just talking about subsistence and what people are eating, technology in regards to what their tools look like, and also kind of mobility in where those tools or animal remains are coming from, in the sense that we can start seeing things like, are there interior spaces, which we can talk about as houses? Are they in exterior spaces? Are we talking about people moving to site together in one location? How many households are there? And we can start asking kind of questions that go beyond the things that we typically get to approach in lots of hunter-gatherer archaeology sites. Now, finally, I also really like talking about hearths because this allows for a much more humanistic view of the past and of the entire population, right? For many of us, when we go camping today, hearths or fire are still an important area for warmth, for light, for camaraderie, for social gatherings, for all of these things that we can connect with. And it creates a much deeper picture of the past than some other kind of sets of archaeological materials. Now, I mentioned that when we see hearths in sites like this, we can actually start looking at architecture. And this is because we can look at the materials that are around hearths to figure out if the activities that are going on around them are in an interior or an exterior space. And basically what this comes down to is that if a hearth is in an interior space, say in a house, we know that there is some sort of superstructure around it. Now, generally, this superstructure includes walls, and those walls function as a barrier for artifacts. So you can picture kind of two views of a hearth in an interior space here. This is the side view. You have your fire in the middle, and then you're kind of like a little bit of space next to it. You have your people walking space, and then you have your space right next to the walls. And this is an overhead view. So there's a hearth in the center, space right next to it, people walking space, wall space, right? So you can think about how this happens in your tent when you go camping normally, right? There's often that really awkward spot when you get near the wall of a tent where it's kind of like not super deep and you can't necessarily sit all the way up against the wall of the tent. So you tend to use that space as storage or sleeping space. And when we look at artifacts, they're basically stopped from moving outside of the tent by that wall, but they tend to gather up against it because there's not people shuffling them around. The other place that we tend to see lots of artifacts gather in interior spaces is right next to the hearth. And this is because people will sit next to a hearth for warmth, for light, for working space. And oftentimes if they're working on something, they'll drop some artifacts and they may not get kind of picked or swept up during cleaning. So what we see is that if we plot the number of artifacts that we see heading out from the center of the hearth, this produces what we call a bimodal distribution. There's two big densities of artifacts. One in this hearth drop zone where lots of people are working and leaving materials behind, and one right up against the wall where stuff just doesn't get cleaned up as much or gets stored. Now we see a very different thing controlling artifacts if we're in an outside space. So you can picture if you're outside with a light and heat source, there's no barrier that's behind you. So what this means is that we either see just increasing amounts of artifacts to a certain degree away from the hearth where people are just kind of dropping them and not picking them up or cleaning them up, or we'll see a unimodal distribution, which is just the result of kind of that drop zone right next to the hearth where people are working, and then nothing ends up behind them. Now, if we apply this idea to the block B or the chopper block area at Laprelle, what we see is that this was probably an interior space with the outside wall occurring a little over 2 meters away from the hearth. So this is what this little circle that you see here. And you can see that if we plot the number of lithics that we have in this area, there's really high concentrations inside where these theoretical walls would be. And the other thing is, if we look at the shape of the ochre stain itself, it really tracks this kind of independent means, in some cases, of bimodality as well, and is probably suggesting that whatever is producing that ochre is an activity that's going on in an interior space. Now, if we put the whole story together of all the things that we have found in this portion of the site, it very clearly looks like a domestic space. We see a variety of stone tools that could be used for a lot of different tasks. We also see worked bone and bone that would be associated with domestic tasks like sewing. We also see a large amount of ochre, which could be for functional tasks, painting hides, etc., or also certainly could be for ritual activities or something else along those lines. We see indications of an interior space. And there are also a little bit of faunal remains in this area, no mammoth, but there is some bison remains. So this seems to suggest that this is actually a space that people are occupying while maybe they may be butchering or doing some other activities with those mammoth remains that are located 12 meters away. Now, once we identified this pattern at Block B, we started seeing it repeat across the site. In 2019, we found another dense concentration of artifacts about the same distance away as Block B, but instead of to the south, it was to the east. This is what we call Block C. We see a set of lithic materials. It does seem like there is a concentration of burning based off those burned lithics right around here, although we don't have those numbers officially done yet, which is why I didn't plot them. And we also think that this is probably an interior space. And when we complete kind of this hearth-centered analysis idea, it will probably also come out as interior. Now, we also see some bison remains in this portion of the site, but one thing that is different is there is a very different lithic raw material. Now, I mentioned that in Block B, most of our lithic raw material was coming from the Hartville Uplift. So the Laprelle site sits right about here. The Hartville Uplift is about 50 miles away downstream, and probably from this region. In contrast, almost all of the stone materials that we find in Block C, we find less of them. Well, less large pieces of them, lots of little pieces, but almost all of it are this brown, translucent, semi-translucent chert that you see here. And we think, based on some work done by a UW master's student, Chase Mahan, that this is coming from Green River Formation sources in the southwest of Wyoming. So this means that we have basically a completely different lithic raw material set that's making up this portion of the site. Same elevation, appears to be occupied at exactly the same time, that's coming on and living also adjacent to these mammoth remains. Now, interestingly, these Southwest Wyoming sources, this is the Sweetwater, which runs into the North Platte. And also this is about the track that we see the Oregon Trail following, partially because it's just a really good way to get across the Rockies. So we may be looking at kind of really early use of that transition, of course, across this portion of the landscape, which can be quite mountainous and different. Now, as far as we can tell, or what the story was to this point, is that we have a set of mammoth remains, and then in very close proximity, we have what was probably the camp that was occupied as this mammoth was processed and butchered. Now, this is not the only site in North America where we have a proposed camp associated with some mammoth kill localities. The other site that has been excavated that has this is the Murray Springs site, which is located in Arizona. But at this site, we see a much greater distance between the kill localities and the Clovis campsite. This is about closer to 80 to 150 meters between these two. The other thing we should note is that Murray Springs has multiple bison and a mammoth kill at it. We know that this Clovis camp is associated with the bison kill for sure because there is a refit. It's unclear if it's associated with the mammoth remains. It very well could be. But it also is a little more complicated because we're looking at multiple kill events and reoccupation of the site. Now, at first, we were really surprised by the proximity between the mammoth remains and the camp. That is a big animal, and you're camping right on top of it. But there is some ethnographic precedent for this. If we look at communities that still occasionally hunt elephants and their ethnographic accounts of them hunting elephants, we do see that oftentimes camps are set up in very close proximity. So this example you see pictured here is from the Fae, who live in the Atiri Forest in Central Africa, where we had some anthropologists observe them take down an elephant. Here is where the elephant carcass was pictured, and they basically set up a camp that they occupied for a few days, along with the Lesse, while they were processing this animal. And the distance between these two, this is 3 meters. So this is right around 12 meters as well. They set it up for proximity, etc. So there certainly is precedent for camping this close to mammoth remains while you're processing an animal, butchering it, preserving, whatever else you are planning on doing. Now, I should note that up to this point, I have not talked about any diagnostic artifacts, but we did find one diagnostic artifact before this season, which I'll talk about our diagnostic artifacts from this season in a moment, which is this point, which was found in 2017 in actually a test unit, a 1 meter by 50 centimeter test unit that was just south of Block B. Now, this is made of a red chert. And you can see it's fluted on this side. It is also fluted on the other side. And unfortunately, we were missing the base, but it is consistent with a Clovis point. Now, obviously, after the discovery of this in a test unit, we were immediately interested in testing all around this material. Now, you can see from my master's site map that's in the corner here, this point came out basically right around here. And we excavated all of this region down here and really didn't find much. We found one other chopper and a few distributed flakes, but it eventually led us to the area that has been the focus of our work for the last 2 years, which is what we call Block D. Now, Block D has really turned some things that we thought we knew about this site on its head. And that's because there are significantly more artifacts in this portion of the site than anywhere else. So all of our materials, when we talk about block A, block B, and block C, we're looking at a few thousand flakes overall. I think five or 6,000 flakes overall. In the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, we have recovered at least 32,000 lithics from this portion of the site. And you can see that we have excavated a pretty large area. So this is 6 meters this way, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 meters, maybe 9, I can't remember, this way that we have completely excavated. I'll note that there are, so this is a bubble map basically showing gradients of flakes. A lot of these ones that are blank around here, some of them are blank because we haven't finished the lab processing, but we have finished counting some of the essential portions. Some of the densest portions of this area have over 1,100 flakes per 50 by 50 centimeter quad. So one thing that I should note, that I should have noted earlier, is that we excavate the site in quads. So this, you can see this here, this is a 1 by 1 meter unit, and we've split it into 4. So basically each of these dots is a 50 by 50 centimeter area. So this is way more artifacts than we have found anywhere else on site. We've also found a number of other materials, like block B and like block C. This appears to be a heart-centered area. We haven't completed the analysis yet, but there is a concentration of calcined bone somewhere around this portion of this area. We also think there's a concentration of lithics that are burned as well that probably fell into the hearth, and that this is probably also an interior space as well. Now up here, this is all of our artifacts that we point plotted in place. Gray is debitage. You can see one thing that we have here is a big concentration of flakes. There's a couple hundred flakes all piled together in this portion of the site. We also see some ochre, although not to the degree in block B, but there are some small nodules of ochre, particularly in the southern portion of this block. And we also see a number of tools, which I'll show you photos of in a second. And then also some larger faunal remains. Now, as far as the type of faunal or animal remains that we're finding in this portion of the site, we have at least one bison. You can see here a bison mandible that was found. It is right here on this map. We also have some smaller fragments of this. We have also found some mammoth ivory. So here are 2 chunks of mammoth ivory. These were found in this northern portion of the block that had been probably broken down by people and would be used for different tools. And then we've also found some other blown tools, particularly this fully eyed bone needle, which was a very exciting day this season or this year in our excavations. So we're definitely seeing some faunal remains that are being eaten, probably, that are consistent with faunal remains we find elsewhere on site. We're also seeing indications that these people are directly associating or using the mammoth remains. And we're seeing some more indications of kind of domestic tasks in the form of something like a bone needle. Now, we also have a ton of lithics in this area. We have more than 120 fragments of stone tools, many of them refit, and you can see some of the refits here. For instance, we have 28 different scrapers, which have come through different portions of this site. So there's probably, or portions of this area. So there's probably lots of hide processing going on, scraping down of hides and cleaning them up. We also found some ultra thin bifaces in this portion of the site. So we found this large piece here. This is a side view of that ultra thin biface. I apologize for my very dirty excavation hand. This is the photo I have at the moment. But you can see this is a really amazing, beautiful tool that is a great example of an ultra thin. And we also have some refitted fragments of the biface that you can see here that come from different portions of this block down here. Now, we also have found some other artifacts that are a little interesting typologically. So here you see a series of a preform, a projectile point, and a series of channel flakes that are all from this portion of the site. Now, one of the biggest happy moments in the crew was the discovery of 3 different portions of this projectile point, which all refit together. They were found about 2.5 meters apart. 2 of them come from here, and 1 is this little dot down here that refit together. You can see this irregular fracture. The reason why it's irregular is it's probably the result of fire. Part of this point was thrown into the fire, probably fragmented, and then was deposited on different portions of the site. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the paleochronology, this is something that if it were found on the surface, we would probably typify as a Folsom point and not a Clovis point, which is definitely an interesting question that we see on this site. And we can also say that some of these channel flakes, particularly given their width and their length, are more consistent with the flutes that you see on we typically associate with Clovis points over, associate with Folsom points over Clovis points. Now, this is definitely an interesting development that we're kind of still working out. And one obvious question off of this is, how old does this site date exactly? Now, since returning to this site in 2014, we've run a number of radiocarbon dates from all different portions of the site. So dates from where the mammoth originate are indicated in red, dates from the ochre area are indicated in blue, dates from our other block are indicated in purple, and dates from this new area are indicated in green. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that lots of our dates have been run on bone collagen, and our bone collagen is kind of all over the place. And this is probably to do with preservation. Now, given that bone collagen can often date young due to contaminants, we tend to place the most faith in our older bone collagen dates. And this overlaps with some calcined bone dates that we have also produced. And our best estimate for the age of this site is about 12,950 calendar years BP, which is within the Clovis age range. Now, we certainly do have some variation in dates, and that probably has to do with the fact that our preservation is good, but it's not fantastic. And so there is a little bit of contamination, which is affecting some of our dates. We also have quite a bit of natural charcoal on site, so it can be really difficult to differentiate between natural charcoal and cultural charcoal, which is why we tend to have turned to bone dating itself to try to get a handle of what exactly is going on. Now, at the moment, our best estimate for the site with the new calibration curve for the radiocarbon dates is 12,950, which does land us in the Clovis time period. But certainly it is not the simplest of dating stories. So what does this mean when we pull it all together? And there's really a few possibilities for what could be going on at the site. And this is where I get a little bit into speculation, but we certainly have more processing to do on the collections that we've assembled. We're still working through lab work on the new area, and we still have a few more years of work left at the site itself. One possibility is that the site was occupied twice. However, that is probably very unlikely. This is probably a single occupation site, and there's a few reasons why we see this. One is that this site is very XY overview spatially organized very logically and well in a way that suggests that it was all occupied at one time. And you can see this if you really look at this XY map. So here is our mammoth ochre area we are currently working in and block C. And you can see that there is very clear spatial patterning, and that we have different hearth-centered areas that are different concentrations of activity, very regularly spaced, which suggests that they're all probably contemporaneous. If they weren't contemporaneous, we'd be much likely to have overlap between them because someone's coming back sometime later. Another reason why this is probably a single occupation site is that while we do have some bioturbation, which causes things to shift vertically, everything is in the same stratigraphic position. Also, most of the artifacts are found not on a stable surface, but instead on a surface that was exposed for some short period of time and then was intermittently buried with really small flood events. So it's not like this is a surface that was there for 300 years that could have accrued artifacts throughout these time periods. So this makes it less likely that this is a multi-component site and much more likely that it is a single component site. The other thing that we can say is that we know that Block D was interacting with these mammoth remains because there's mammoth ivory in Block D. So we know that there are some relationships between these different areas. Now, another possibility, or one possibility that is certainly the case, is that there is way more variation in fluted point typology than we tend to accept. Now, if I would feel pretty confident, although I think you could also talk to various people who would maybe have different opinions, that if this point were found on the surface, it would be typified as a Clovis point. If this point were found on the surface, it would probably be typified as a Folsom point. But what we could be seeing is that maybe we are kind of over-selecting and underappreciating the amount of variation we see in Clovis or Folsom technology, and that is what is playing into kind of the differences that we see between these, and the fact that we want to split them up when they're in the same place archaeologically. Now, I should also note these two points were found within, I think it's like 12 or 14 meters of each other and in very similar vertical kind of absolute elevation. Now, our last possibility is that we're seeing the production of both of these, something that we would typically identify as Clovis, something we typically identify as Folsom at the same time on the site itself. And it's important to keep in mind that kind of recent dating work for both Clovis and Folsom time periods have opened the door to the fact that we may see some overlap between these technologies existing in the world. Particularly, there was some recent work by Buchanan et al. That was just published this last year, talking especially about Western Clovis Folsom and the potential for overlap between Clovis and Folsom occupations in the West. And they suggested that there could be up to 200 years, so multiple generations of overlap between Clovis and Folsom, things that we identify as Folsom and Clovis individuals. So there is the possibility that we're looking at a site where we have both being made at the same time. Now, we definitely still need some more work to kind of figure out which of these seems most likely. I am pretty confident that we are looking at a single occupation in this case, but we certainly can talk about other ways that we're working on kind of confirming contemporaneity on the site. But with the way that we're seeing the stratigraphy and spatial dynamics, that does seem to be the case. Now, if we do talk about these three hearth-centered areas being single occupation, we can start getting at those questions that talk more than just kind of what the technology looks like and what people are eating, and into some like social dynamics and organizations of these communities. So the first one of these that we could talk about would be mobility. Not just how far are people coming, but how are they living when they're moving? So say each of these different hearth-centered spaces are households. If all of these households are moving across the landscape independently, we would expect them all to bring different lithic raw materials to the site, and that we should see kind of spatial patterning by lithic raw material around different hearths. If they're all coming onto the site together, we should expect the lithic raw materials to look the same, no matter which hearth you're looking at, or we could end up with something in between. Now, as far as what we're looking at or what it's looking like at the moment, we know that Block C has a completely different lithic raw material set than Blocks B or D. Block D does also have a lot of part bill uplift, but it certainly has some lithic raw materials that Block B doesn't have as well. And we're still kind of working out what those dynamics could be. So there's still some more to be said about this story. Now, we could also talk about who's actively participating in the butchery of the mammoth. So we have about 60 artifacts sitting around the mammoth. And we could ask kind of what do those lithic materials look like and what different hearth-centered areas do they come from? Does it represent all of the hearth-centered areas? Does it represent only one of the hearth-centered areas? And what does that tell us around what or who was in charge of butchering the mammoth remains? Now, finally, we can also look at how different resources on site are being shared and if different hearth-centered activity areas are sharing their resources between each other. One obvious avenue for this is mammoth ivory. We know we have ivory at Block D. We've also had a recent University of Wyoming master's student, Molly Heron, who did some work identifying really small fragments of ivory that we were seeing associated in some of the areas and confirmed that some of the other areas like Block B, and I think also Block C, have some ivory fragments at them, which would suggest that these communities are sharing these ivory pieces. We could also look at some of the other things that are on site. We have not found many mammoth remains outside of the mammoth bone bed itself. Well, we haven't found any except for ivory outside of the mammoth bone bed itself. But one thing that we have seen is we found bison at all of these other houses. So asking if that is one bison that is being shared can tell us something about how these resources are being shared. And as I mentioned, we do see ivory definitely being shared across some of these different hearth-centered areas. So when we start putting this story of Laprelle together, we can get a much fuller picture of what is going on in the past, what social organization and dynamics look like, what types of activities people are doing, and hopefully can dive more into that kind of humanistic view of the past. Really, the identification of a campsite in and of itself associated with dead or a deceased mammoth is really interesting in the sense that that's going to be a place where everyone in the community is. We're going to see children, we're going to see elderly, we're going to see men, we're going to see women, we're going to see everyone participating in these events, and potentially different groups of people from different parts of the region coming together for this. So what does that tell us about what life was like at the end of the Ice Age and kind of how we can think about these communities and their complete lives in this setting? So basically where we're getting at with Laprelle, we still have another couple seasons of excavations. There's a possibility that there's one other kind of hearth-centered area in this region, or we can kind of continue to fill out some of these other areas. We also have yet to identify actually how far to the north, south, or east, or sorry, excuse me, west the site extends. The east is obviously gone. And it's possible that this site is much more extensive than we thought previously. This last summer, we started an auger grid, which was quite challenging when you consider we're augering at least 3 or 4 meters into the ground. And we found materials over 50 meters away that appear to be from the same time period, although we're still working on getting some radiocarbon dates. So this means that the site could be much larger than we were expecting. And it also could be really interesting in the sense that this could be one area of research, and this is something I'm particularly interested in returning to some of these other Proboscidean butchery sites and kind of seeing if we can figure out kind of how this compares to other cases. The Murray Springs, as I mentioned, Murray Springs is the only other site where we see a camp definitely associated with Proboscidean remains, although it has some, it's certainly multi-component, which makes it a little more difficult to suss out kind of the same degree of questions. But it certainly can also act as a nice comparator to Laprelle, and there's potential for other sites being this way. The other thing is that if we think about that all of these, potentially all of these mammoth butchery or kill sites that we see had camps associated with them, kind of changes our landscape of what Clovis camps look like and where we should be looking to find them. It's long been discussed that on the plains, there are very few sites that really look like a base camp for Clovis. And this opens the potential that maybe though all those base camps are sitting next to large animal kills and is something that we haven't seen for a variety of reasons. It's really important to remember that the only reason we found these materials at Laprelle was really due to some luck and a very good archaeologist who sure was paying attention when he was just digging a path. And that actually was the case at Murray Springs as well. So this is something that was really fortuitous and has really opened up our understanding potentially of the Pleistocene people that were living in Wyoming over 12,000 years ago. Now, obviously, work like this never happens in isolation. I mentioned my co-PIs. This has been a long time collaborative project. We're also very thankful to the Strock family for allowing us to do this work and many other members of the Douglas community, including the Amons, and the Bakers for helping us throughout the years. We've also had probably hundreds at this point of excavators on the site, many years of the University of Wyoming Field School, and without their really hard work and digging through very hard dirt, we would not know as much as we do. And of course, we are always thankful to our different institutions that have contributed funds, including the National Science Foundation, the Quest Archaeological Research Program, the Schliemann Center for Quaternary Studies, the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, National Geographic, the Friesen Institute, and the University of Wyoming itself, who have all aided in being able to do this work. So I will leave it there, and I am happy to answer any questions or try to give you some answers to your questions. Thank you.
All right. Thinking about it, does anybody have any questions?
So Madeline, what do you think about this idea of what kind of Briggs Buchanan and those guys were talking about this 200-year overlap, given what the lithics look like, and what do you know in terms of how many Clovis sites besides sites like Jake Bluff have sizable amounts of bison at them?
So there are definitely, I can say a number of the proboscidean sites, actually, I would guess over half of the mammoth, mastodon, butchery sites have bison at them too. It is very common to find bison and mammoth both at the same site. So I don't think the presence of the bison alone kind of discounts the possibility that we're looking at the mammoth being a kill in those cases. As far as kind of this idea of overlap, I mean, they have always been really close in time, and you have to have a transition between technologies at some point. I would also say that I think maybe the idea that we haven't had a full appreciation for some of the diversity, particularly in Clovis, I would argue, might be fair in the sense that you can certainly see how there could be some like confirmation bias in that. And this is not to say I would be guilty of that as well, right? You tend to kind of associate things strongly with the technological set you see. What the chances are of us finding the place where both are being created, I don't know. And I will say this, from the moment we found the first, it basically we were on site for 6 weeks this summer. We found the first part of that 3-part fluted point fragment, like week 1 or 2. We found the second part week 3 or 4, and we found the last part like the last 4 days on site, because that's how it goes in archaeology. And from the moment we pulled out this first fragment, all of us were like, that looks pretty little more fulsome to me. And so when this ear came out, we were like, yeah, that is something that if it were found on the surface, it would probably classify as fulsome. So it definitely opens some interesting questions.
Okay, because it's interesting too. I know at Jake Bluff, they recovered a fulsome point there, but stratigraphically it was above the Clovis materials. But it's still kind of interesting to kind of look at, kind of traditional, reoccupying places on the landscape at Jake Bluff, and here at La Prelle, you've got potentially something really exciting. I mean, it's obviously really exciting for sure, but the idea that you've got kind of the end of this tradition and the beginning of another tradition right there. I mean, I'm sure you're being, pretty conservative with what the potentials are, but this is really exciting.
Yeah, and I will say, so we certainly do have some bioattribution on site, but the vertical, like the fact that these are, this far apart from each other, about, I think it's like 12 or 13, I'd have to double check, 12 or 14 meters, is like, that's really close in XY space, and they're very close in Z. I think it's within a couple centimeters. I would have to double check. But it's very close, or within a few, I should say, centimeters. So it would have to be a very short time span if they are different occupations. And I really think that it's more likely that it's a single occupation site.
No, I mean, it definitely sounds like that.
So.
Do you have any further questions from virtual land or over here? No? Okay, well, thank you so much, Madeline. That was a great presentation. It was much for coming to talk with us.
Yeah, happy to talk about it. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope
everyone's giving you a round of applause. I can't hear it.
Yeah, okay. I can't hear anything from behind you.
Okay, well, we were. I promise.
Okay, all right.